But I just wanted to go over a few ground rules. For the most part, if you could leave yourself on mute, just so that we don't get a whole lot of reverb, that would be great. And I am going to be sharing my screen in a minute, but just to let all of you know, once I put my screen up, I can't see any of you. I can't see hands going up. I can't see the chat. So Diana has agreed to be the moderator here. So if you have questions, I am not.
Hold on. You got on mute. I need to unmute you. Sorry about that.
Am I unmuted? Okay, let me get my I'm going to ask, since I can't see anybody, are you all able to see my screen? Diana, are you able to see?
Yep, I am able to see.
Awesome. I'm going to get started. So welcome, everybody. I'm going to jump right into it because I will do my best to stick with our time frame. Each of these 3 sessions, as you know, we have on Mondays. So today, the 15th and the 22nd. And each session will run roughly between an hour to an hour and a half. And I am going to try to leave 5 or 10 minutes at the end of each session to hopefully answer any questions that you might have. And it doesn't even have to be questions. It could be comments. It could be share a story, whatever you would like. So I want to make this fun, not just me jabbering at everybody else here. So I also wanted to put an agenda together so you are kind of know what to expect for the 3 separate trainings. So today, obviously, the first one is going to be very generic, looking at big picture food safety. So we will be focusing on what a foodborne illness is, talking about what the TCS foods, and probably a lot of you are familiar with what I'm talking about, but this is the new name for potentially hazardous foods. We now call these time temperature control for safety foods. So we'll talk about those. A big part of the meeting tonight is talking about the risk factors for foodborne illness. This is not the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I've had people ask me that. So foodborne illness is the abbreviation here. And there are basically 5 big risk factors that I'm going to be spending time on. And then we will talk a little bit about allergies at the very end. But I did want to share the agenda for the next. My slides are not going to the next slide here. Hold on a moment. So here we go, Diana. My slides are stuck. Hold on just a moment, please. Let me start this again. Okay. And I'm going to have to ask you again, Diana, if you're able to see the screen.
Yes, can see the screen.
Okay, we are progressing. So next week on the 15th, we're going to get a little more hands-on as much as possible as you can get hands-on during a Zoom. So what I've been able to do is some videos that I've recorded in the past of actually doing things we will have next week. But one of those is showing how to calibrate different types of thermometers, talk about temperature requirements, cooking, cooling requirements, reheating, thawing procedures. And then the very last day, talking about some of the new regulations that took place about a year before COVID hit. And what I found is regulations in Massachusetts changed significantly in October around 2018. And roughly a year later, when people were starting to get used to the new code, COVID hit, and then we all know what happened. Returning back to work, we kind of reverted back to some of the old codes. So the last day I'm talking about some of the new items, such as date marking, the requirements for having the vomiting and diarrheal SOPs, and cleanup kit requirements. So in all of my seminars, whether I'm doing what we're doing today, a basic food safety 101, or if I'm doing an all day or week-long serve safe course, I always show a picture of this article, and this is from 1996. And the reason I show this is people often ask me how and why I became involved with food safety. And just to give you some of my background, before I started as a food safety consultant, I was an epidemiologist. And prior to COVID, a lot of people didn't know what that was. But basically, I was one of the persons from the state who would investigate outbreaks of all different types of communicable diseases. And often they were foodborne illnesses. And one of the very last cases that I had been involved with and investigated was a salmonella outbreak that occurred at a Wendy's restaurant in Natick. And the reason why this one was pretty much that case that got me involved in food safety is we were investigating this case for several weeks. And we were regularly having conference calls with the local health department and trying to investigate this and implement control measures. But one of the very last conference calls that we had right before we were getting ready to call in, we got a knock on our door, and the secretary popped her head into the room and she said, you know, to all of you sitting here, before you start this conference call, I want to let you know that we just got a notification of a death from this outbreak. And I just remember sitting in that room with my colleagues, all of us in complete silence, because what had happened at this outbreak is some of the employees who were working at this Wendy's were colonized with a bacteria called salmonella. And it wasn't salmonella that was a poultry problem. They were colonized with this bacteria. It was later discovered hygiene issues for cropping up. Bare hand contact was observed, et cetera, et cetera. This case really inspired me to get out in the world and start talking about food safety to restaurant folks, people who work in catering operations, prison facilities, nursing homes. This is really the case that got me into the world of food safety. Instead of investigating outbreaks after they occurred and after the deaths occurred, really trying to prevent something from occurring. And my screen is frozen again. Diana?
Yes.
When somebody, and this is, I think, what's happening, when somebody needs to be admitted, my screen freezes, which is an interesting COVID thing. So I'm going to jump back in. Can you see my screen?
Not anymore.
Okay.
Everyone is admitted.
Okay.
Is waiting.
This is welcome to the world of COVID and having to deal with technology issues. How are we doing right now?
Now we can see your screen.
Okay. All right, let's talk about a foodborne illness. So basically everything that I talk about in all of my classes, again, basic food safety classes, SURF-Safe certification courses, is trying to prevent a foodborne illness. Everything that we do, the entire food code, is all about preventing a foodborne illness. So a foodborne illness is basically a disease that is caused by eating food that has something harmful in it. And that something harmful could either be a bacteria, it could be a virus, it could be some other pathogens, parasites, or toxins. A foodborne illness can also be acquired by ingesting something that might have a chemical in it, or even something that has some food that has something physical in it. So maybe a piece of broken glass gets into a piece of food and it causes an illness or injury. In terms of statistics, this is very interesting. When I started teaching this class, and I am definitely dating myself here, but in 1997, I started teaching the SURF-Safe classes. At that point, every single year in this country, we had about 76 million people develop a foodborne illness, which was huge, a lot bigger than the number that you're seeing on my screen right now. We also every year had anywhere between, 5, 6, 7,000 deaths every single year. And around 2011, new statistics came out. So what happened when I first started teaching this is there was no recommendation in Massachusetts for the SURF-Safe certification. And 2 years later, the FDA really was stressing the importance to everyone, the requirements for food service establishments to have somebody trained and certified in food protection. So about, 10 and 12 years later, new statistics came out. And I say this in all my classes, we now only have 48 million people developing a foodborne illness. And people laugh at me because that is a huge number, but it did go down significantly. Our goal in training people in food safety classes like this and requiring the certification is to hopefully continue to get these numbers go down. But currently, our average number of deaths every single year in this country from a foodborne illness is about 3,000. And that is a huge number. I do remember one year, maybe 5-10 years ago, where we had almost 10,000 people die from a foodborne illness. And the hard thing about a foodborne illness is this is not something that we can avoid by deciding we're not going to eat anymore. We have to eat. So we have to be able to make sure that the food that we're serving, that we're eating, is going to be safe. You'll notice at the bottom of my slide here, I have a question here. Has anyone ever had a foodborne illness? This is really tough to do in a Zoom class, but this is a question that I ask in my ServSafe classes that I teach. And it's just a generic question. How many of you have ever had a foodborne illness? And I ask people to raise their hand, and maybe a third to half of the people in the room will raise their hand. And then I say, okay, we're going to do this a little bit differently. Raise your right hand if you've ever vomited. And people will start to put their right hand up. And basically at this point, everybody in the room will have their hand up. And then I will ask, leaving your right hand up, raise your left hand if you've ever had diarrhea. Eventually, every single person in the room will have both hands up in the air. And this is a point that I like to make, that every one of us at some point in our lives have had a foodborne illness. And this is why our body gets these symptoms. We've ingested something we are not supposed to ingest. And our bodies, being the very efficient machines that they are, will do something to get rid of whatever it was we ingested. If we ingest a toxin, it might be that we start violently vomiting within 60 minutes of consuming the food, or maybe it's a pathogen that doesn't show up with symptoms right away, but 2, 3, 4, up to 70 days later, symptoms will start to develop, and often that will be diarrhea. My slide is stuck again. I'm going to regroup here and not put it in presentation mode so that it doesn't keep doing that. So give me a second to get out of here. Okay, I do apologize, people. I'm going to share one more time. And now you're seeing it in a little different format. Is this okay with everybody? Can you still see it well enough?
People are nodding, thumbs up.
A nod, a thumbs up is acceptable in my world. Thank you. So used to doing this. Any type of feedback I get is thrilling. So, all right, I will be able to move on. So one of the things that I wanted to point out when it comes to foodborne illness, and I mentioned that every single year we have on average 3,000 people who will die. It's usually from what we call highly susceptible populations. And not all of you are from highly susceptible populations or work in like a nursing home or in a hospital or a daycare, but just to be aware that there are certain groups who are much more likely to develop a foodborne illness than the general population. And once they develop a foodborne illness, they are much more likely to suffer severe consequences. So those deaths that I'm talking about, it's often going to be in the elderly. It might be in the very young. Pregnant women are much more susceptible in the fetus. And then those people who we call immunocompromised. So they could be immunocompromised because they have cancer and they are on chemotherapy. It could be because they have AIDS or HIV. It could be because they've had a bone marrow transplant, a spleen removed. So these are all conditions that would make somebody much more susceptible. And even for those of you that represent a general population establishment, so you're not a highly susceptible like nursing home or hospital, you do have people that dine at your places that fit these categories. And you have to assume that everybody who comes in might have a condition that would make them more susceptible. So it's so important, even if you're not working in a hospital or nursing home, to really follow the food safety precautions that I talk about. So in terms of food safety, I'm going to start at the very, very basics. There are certain foods that are much more risky than other food items that prior to changing our food code in 2018, we used to call these potentially hazardous foods. And what I would tell people is these foods, if they are not under time and temperature control, have the potential to make people sick. Now we have a name that we refer to these as time temperature control for safety foods. And I say that very quickly because it's a big, long name. So we abbreviate this by calling these TCS foods, which I mentioned early on in the slides. So time temperature control for safety foods, I think of them in three big categories. One of the first categories is going to be my high protein animal-based food items. For everybody listening in, this is probably very, very obvious. These are the foods when we get back from the grocery store, whether we are receiving these in our back delivery docks, must be refrigerated immediately, because these items normally have bacteria on them. Not being put away, bacteria can start to grow rapidly. So any type of poultry, meat, fish, shellfish, eggs, dairy, all of these are my high protein animal-based food items. I have another category that the food code, and this is one thing that I always teach in ServSafe, and I'm sure a lot of you are ServSafe certified. And Diana, were you able to do a little quiz about
yes,
who's?
I can have a little poll. So let me launch it. So the question is, are you ServSafe certified? So something should pop up where you guys can answer yes or no. I don't know if you can see the results, Lisa, but it's
I
looking.
can. This is
You can?
really cool. I have to do this for my other classes. So we got our answers out of the 40 some people.
We have
50 some
51
people.
out of
Awesome.
63 right now, so about 80% participation. So of those who participated, majority
certified.
are certified, which is
Excellent. So certification, if you've all been certified within the last probably 5 years, is it showing on my screen still, Diana?
great. No, I just ended it. So
Okay, for some reason it's on my screen. I'll get out of it. So here's a terminology that's used by the FDA, which you will find in the ServSafe courses and exams. Another example of a TCS food is what the FDA calls heat treated plant foods, which you and I in the real world would call these cooked fruits and vegetables. So any type of food that comes from the ground that's grown, a plant food, a potato, rice, wheat that we use for pasta, onions, carrots, you name it, it's a heat treated plant food becomes a TCS. So heat treated, it could be boiled, it could be fried, it could be blanched, sauteed. So heat treated, cooked in any way, plant food, fruit or vegetable becomes a TCS food. So baked potato, mashed potatoes, French fries, cooked rice, these have to be hot. So held at 135 or higher, or if these are cooked and then cooled, they have to be held at 41 or colder. And then I have a third category, and I don't know what to call it. So I'm just calling these other food items, which over the years, we've been adding to this list of other food items. One that was probably the latest addition was cut leafy greens. I don't know how long some of you have been around, but I remember when this first was introduced in the food code after a large nationwide spinach outbreak. I don't know if any of you remember that, when we identified that spinach was contaminated. I believe it was with E. coli. And we started to realize that not only spinach, but things like lettuce, romaine lettuce, and cabbage were identified as a food that required refrigeration for safety. And I don't know if any of you remember when this happened about 15 years ago. It was a huge, huge thing at the time. But raw sprouts is another TCS food. And what's very interesting with raw sprouts is they have been implicated in just about every single outbreak with just about every type of pathogen. And because raw sprouts are such a risky food item, they're actually outright illegal to serve in a highly susceptible population. So if you were a nursing home and had a beautiful salad bar set up and you had raw sprouts out there, that is a violation in the food code, because you have an item that is very risky in a population that is much more susceptible than the general population. Cut tomatoes, so any type of tomato that you take a knife to, sliced, diced, you cut a tomato, it is a TCS food. It must be under refrigeration. Obviously, when it's a whole tomato, room temperature is where we're going to store them, just like with a cut melon. Melon, watermelon, honeydew, cantaloupe, not cut, room temperature is how we store these items. But the minute you cut these items, they must be under temperature control. Bacteria can and will grow in these items. Tofu, and can we do another poll where somebody can actually answer a question, Diana? I'm very curious. I have a lot of ServSafe certified people here. Can
I mean,
anybody?
people can add their answers in the chat and I could read off some of the
Oh,
answers.
I'm curious. Anybody know why we're concerned about garlic and oil mixtures? It seems like so random compared to some of the other food items identified as TCS foods. Anybody know why or what the bacteria is that's associated with garlic and oil mixtures?
So if anyone has an answer, you could throw it into the chat. So we got the answer: botulism, spores inside.
Yes and yes.
Botulism.
Whoever answered those questions correctly, you're going to take over the seminar from here. I'll just give you the slide. It's very good. I'm impressed that you knew this. So garlic and oil mixture, it's a very random thing, but it is associated with botulism, which is potentially deadly. So moving on. So those are the TCS foods. The risk factors I was going to be talking about in the agenda, some of the big risk factors for people developing a foodborne illness. Risk factors, and I always like to point out, these are the things that we actually do or don't do that could cause an illness or an outbreak. And there's 5 categories. I'm just going to start with this one first, and then the next slide is going to jump into the next 4. But one of the big risk factors for people developing a foodborne illness is purchasing food from unsafe vendors. And basically what this means is you all are identified in the food code as retail food establishments. You are required by law to get your food from a wholesaler. You have to get your food from a wholesaler who is in compliance with the law. They have all the permits, they are following GMPs. So you as a retailer may not get your food from another retailer. And I'll give you an example of what might happen. You run out of eggs for a Sunday brunch. And instead of canceling your Sunday brunch, you call Lisa's Luncheonette next door. Hey, Lisa, I know you're not doing Sunday brunch. Can we borrow a case of eggs? Sure, come on over. I know this happens in the real world like every second of every day, but this would be an example of an unsafe, unapproved vendor. And the reason for this, people will often argue with me on this. Let's say you and the restaurant next door happen to get your products or your eggs or whatever it is from the same vendor. And this vendor has beautifully refrigerated trucks. They have Bluetooth thermometers. They have trained drivers. But once that product was delivered, maybe it wasn't under time and temperature control. Maybe somehow it became contaminated, and that would result in a possible illness or outbreak on your part. But I have examples up here of mushrooms. This has been an issue in the past. Mushrooms, if they are not from an approved vendor, could be deadly. And there have been many cases where people have gone out foraging on their own and selecting mushrooms that maybe looked like a safe mushroom that ended up being a poisonous mushroom, and people have become very ill and actually died from this. And then another example is with shellfish. Shellfish can be contaminated with certain toxins, and a way to prevent this is to get all shellfish from a reputable vendor. You can't go down to the Cape and go get your own shellfish and bring it back to the restaurant. So the next risk factors that I'm going to be spending the next probably half an hour talking about, I lump into my own categories. 4 big risk factors. First one is time and temperature abuse. Next one is contaminated equipment. I also go back and forth between saying contaminated equipment and cross-contamination, which I will do in the slides. Poor personal hygiene, and then poor or improper cleaning and sanitizing. Of these 4, time and temperature abuse represents about 90% of outbreaks from food service establishments. So of the 4, when your inspectors are coming out, when I do inspections, I am often highly focused on these time temperature issues, because maintaining proper temperatures is really going to make your food safety program that much better. So jumping in to time temperature abuse. All of you should be familiar with this. I'm sure that those of you who are ServSafe certified probably have this drilled into your head, but these numbers have changed in the last few years. There's something called a temperature danger zone. And this danger zone is currently, and I put this in big red numbers, is 41 to 135. And what this means is bacteria will grow between the temperatures of 41 and 135. So your goal in life, whether you're at work or you're at home, is to keep those TCS foods out of that range. 41 or below is fine. 135 or above is fine, but keeping food in that range can absolutely lead to a foodborne illness or an outbreak. Another thing that I wanted to point out on this slide is you'll notice that I have a little drawing of a thermometer here, and you can see between this, in this blue, we have the temperature danger zone 41 to 135. You'll notice, if you're able to see this on your computers, if you're on your phone, you might not be able to see this, so I apologize, but you'll see something in red here, which I refer to as an extreme danger zone. 70 to 125 is an extreme danger zone, meaning that certain bacteria could double every 10 or 15 minutes in this extreme danger zone. And one of the demonstrations I like to do, and I didn't get this prepared, so I'm going to use a hair clip here. And this is where I really like to have in-person class, but we're going to deal with this. So let's pretend that I have a little bacteria here, one cell bacteria. In this room, it's roughly 70 degrees. In 10 minutes, this is going to double. Another 10 minutes, it will double. So right now there's one cell, and it will become 2, 4, 6, 8, 16, 32, to the point after about 4 to 6 hours, depending on the temperature of this room that I'm sitting in would be completely filled from floors, walls to the ceiling with this one bacterial cell that I started with. So it's critically important when you are monitoring temperatures that this is a range that we need to discard foods. It could be a big problem when it comes to safety. But other time temperature abuse would include cooking foods or not cooking foods to the final internal temperatures. Major risk factor identified by the FDA. And when I say cooking foods to the wrong internal temperatures, for those of you who've gone through certification courses, you know the cooking temperature for poultry is 165. You have to cook hamburger to 155. Eating sushi is very dangerous. We do allow these products to be uncooked or served raw, as long as you have a consumer advisory in your menu, which I'm going to talk about in a second. I am one of those that loves my hamburger purple bloody rare, and I love sushi, and I love raw oysters. As long as you have those consumer advisories on your menu, identify the food that's going to be undercooked or raw, and then have a reminder statement indicating that consuming these foods could result in me developing a foodborne illness, that is acceptable. However, my father, who's in his late 80s, who's been very, very sick, I would never take him out to a seafood restaurant and order a plate of raw oysters. It is too risky. I would never serve him a hamburger that is not fully cooked because he's highly susceptible and it's much too risky. Time temperature abuse, I talked about holding food at the wrong temperatures. Improper cooling is another major risk factor. So if we're cooking something like a stock or maybe a beef stew, and we're going to serve it another day, if it's not cooled properly, that can result in another foodborne illness. And then finally, if we are not reheating properly. So time temperature abuse, this is huge when it comes to safety of food. I mentioned undercooked or raw food items. Any of you who happen to have a children's menu, if you are serving hamburger or ground beef, you cannot have this consumer advisory that I was referring to. There is a bacteria associated with hamburger that's not fully cooked. I'm assuming most of you have heard of E. coli. This E. coli bacteria is so dangerous, can be so dangerous for kids 9 and under. If they develop or if they ingest this bacteria, they are at a greater risk of developing something called hemolytic uremic syndrome. And there's something like a 20% fatality rate with these kids that develop this. So if you do have a child's or children's menu, do not offer the hamburger to be cooked to order or raw. Even having the consumer advisory on the menu is now against the food code. So preventing time and temperature abuse. In the agenda that I had talked about earlier, I will be showing some videos on how to calibrate different thermometers, but it's critically important that you are monitoring temperatures, and the only way that you can really monitor them is to make sure that you have thermometers. Whatever thermometer you use, whether it's a bimetallic thermometer like you see in the slide here, it's a digital thermometer, it's a thermopen, make sure that it is working properly. You have to be calibrating it, and I will be showing a video on calibrating a thermometer 2 weeks from today. That's in the third session here. Quick question on if you can do another poll, Diana. How many of you have at least one thermometer in your kitchen? And you won't be in trouble for identifying yourselves as somebody who doesn't have a thermometer. Do all of you have access to a food thermometer in your kitchens? Should I have given you advance notice on this, Diana? I got Mary has a hand up. I could only see one hand, and I can't see everybody with my slides here. I see 32 people responding to this. Do we have a resounding, everybody has a thermometer? I'll move on while you're telling our results here. So another risk factor for foodborne illness, I call it cross-contamination. It could be contaminated equipment, but I really love this photo. This really demonstrates what not to do. And if you're not able to see this very well, I have a cutting board with very raw chicken being cut and prepared on the same cutting board as the lettuce here. Obviously major risk factor here. Preventing cross-contamination. Many different things that we need to consider to prevent cross-contamination. One of which comes from the picture that you see here, is making sure that all of your equipment, utensils, countertops, cutting boards, prep tables have been cleaned and sanitized after any food prep. And then anytime any type of contamination may have occurred. And one thing that I want to point out about cutting boards, I think most people are very aware not to use a